Bom, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Um prazer enorme estar aqui com a gente de novo no nosso seminário, para continuar, então, o nosso seminário internacional. A gente tem um prazer enorme de convidar a doutora Maris Brenn-White para estar aqui com a gente. Ela, então, vai dar abertura à linha de pesquisa de diagnóstica e terapêutica. Então, eu vou aqui apresentar o currículo dela em inglês e depois em português. Tá? Então, sintam-se à vontade para fazer perguntas no chat, que a gente vai estar juntando essas perguntas e, na medida do possível, vai estar falando, respondendo a todas elas, ou parte delas, dependendo do tempo que a gente tiver. E assim que a gente encerrar aqui, então eu já peço a vocês, os alunos, para terem o link do Meeting aí quietinho com vocês, porque aí então a gente vai para o Google Meeting para avaliação dos alunos, onde todos os professores e alunos do programa estão convidados a participar, tá? And then, thank you so much, Maris, for having you here. It's a totally pleasure for us to host you in this event. It's our first seminar, and it's a pleasure to have you. I'd like to introduce Maris. Dr. Maris Brenn-White is a wildlife veterinarian with a DVM and Master of Preventive Veterinary Medicine, both from University of California, Davis. She spent her early career at the University of California, San Francisco, researching novel prevention methods for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections in sub-Saharan Africa. During her veterinary training, she completed internships with the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project at the San Diego Zoo, conducted field-based surveillance of avian influenza in gulls, and researched West Nile virus vaccine efficacy in US. For her master research, she assessed the risk of canine distemper spillover from domestic ranching dogs to jaguars in indigenous communities in Nicaragua, Bolsua Biospheres Reserve. Just prior to joining the Institute for Conservation Medicine, Maris served as research associated with the Wildlife Health Center at UC Davis. She joined the St. Louis Zoo Institute for Conservation Medicine in 2018 as a research fellow, conducting studies at the intersection of wildlife, domestic animal, human, and ecosystem health, including camel health in Kenya, assessment of confiscated hadate tortoises in Madagascar, vulture poisoning in South Africa, and infection disease in local turtles in New Zealand. Now I'm going to talk in português. Então, a doutora Maris Brenn-White é a veterinária de animais silvestres, com graduação pela Universidade da Califórnia, em Davis, e ela é mestre em medicina veterinária preventiva também pela mesma Universidade da Califórnia, em Davis. Ela passou o início da carreira dela pesquisando novos métodos de prevenção para HIV e outras doenças sexualmente transmissíveis na África subsaariana. Atuou no projeto, como veterinária do projeto Gorila, no Zoológico de San Diego, conduziu vigilância de campo de gripe aviária em gaivotas e pesquisou a eficácia da vacina contra o vírus do Nilo Ocidental nos Estados Unidos. Como mestrado, ela avaliou o risco de transmissão da sinomose canina de cães de caça para onças em comunidades indígenas na Nicarágua, América Central. Pouco antes de ingressar no Instituto de Medicina da Conservação do Zoológico de St. Louis, Maris trabalhou como pesquisadora associada na Universidade de Califórnia, em Davis. Desde 2018, então, ela é pesquisadora do Zoológico de St. Louis, dentro do Instituto de Medicina da Conservação, conduzindo estudos dessa interface saúde única, mais especificamente saúde de camelas no Quênia, avaliação de tartarugas confiscadas em Madagascar, na África, ambos na África, envenenamento de abutres também no sul da África e doenças infecciosas em répteis nos Estados Unidos. Then it's an amazing pleasure for having you here. I'm really happy, and I'm sure that all the students will enjoy a lot, and all the other inviters will enjoy a lot your presentation. And feel free to start, and I'll be here if you have any doubt. Thank you so much, Maris.
Thank you, Lillian, for that amazing and generous introduction. And thank you all for inviting me and coming to listen to my talk today, and for accommodating me because I don't speak Portuguese. So you're letting me speak to you in English, which is my first language, and I also appreciate that. I know that that isn't easy for everyone to listen to. What I'm going to be talking about with all of you today is conservation medicine. We'll talk more about what that is, but specifically conservation medicine from the perspective of wildlife and ecosystem health and their roles in preventing human pandemics like the one that we are living through right now. And to let you know a little bit about my perspective and where I come from, as Dr. Catenacci mentioned, I currently am a fellow at the Institute for Conservation Medicine, which is actually a research department within the St. Louis Zoo. So I'm a little bit of an unusual presenter that way. I'm not faculty, I'm not in a university, I'm actually at a zoo. So we do a lot of really applied work. Our mission is to take a holistic approach to wildlife conservation, public health, and sustainable ecosystems to ensure healthy animals and healthy people. And for those of you who don't know where St. Louis is, we're this little red dot. We're sort of right in the middle of the US. And we have about 12 different active programs in 8 places around the globe. One of those programs is Dr. Catenacci's really excellent work on arbovirus surveillance, which I hope you will have a chance to talk to her about if you don't know about it already. And because we are at a zoo, you can sort of see from this map, we tend to make individual wild animal species are often the focus of our programs. But what unites all of these programs is that they all take a conservation medicine approach. And so I've said conservation medicine several times now, but what is conservation medicine? This may not be a familiar term for you. It was sort of invented in the early 2000s to describe a new discipline that focused on health at the interface of the human, animal, and environment. And the key words there are interfaces or interactions. And then, as you can see, the underlines are humans, animals, and environment. And really, this is just a way to put diseases and put humans all in the ecosystems together so that we can understand how all these things interact for the benefit of all. And if you take a quick look at this Venn diagram, this talk has a lot of Venn diagrams in it, but I just want you to notice this was the original one first published when conservation medicine was coined as a term, and we have animal diseases up here, human, and ecosystem. Those are sort of the 3 components. So a term that you might be more familiar with is One Health. One Health, the definition from the OIE is really just the concept that human health and animal health are interdependent and bound to the health of the ecosystems in which they exist. So those are the exact same principles as conservation medicine, right? So we have the 3 components, human, animal, and ecosystem. And the focus is on those interfaces or interconnections or interdependence. And if we look at the One Health Venn diagram that you're probably more familiar with, it has the exact same components. It has human health, animal health, and environmental health. So One Health really is an extension of conservation medicine, and I really use those terms synonymously. So if you hear me say conservation medicine, you can think One Health. If you hear me say One Health, you can think conservation medicine. So when we think about the big One Health issues that are out there today, there's a ton of them, but one thing about One Health is that it is inherently interdisciplinary. So it's health, which we think of as biomedical sciences, human medicine, veterinary medicine, but it's also food security. It is also antimicrobial resistance, and biodiversity loss. It is other environmental health components like pollutants and contamination, or habitat loss and degradation itself. Climate change is a really big, pressing One Health issue. And some of the things that we think about less frequently are even things like social and economic equity. So the way we distribute wealth and resources and power have a lot to do with how health is distributed. And so I wanted to just take you through my sort of first experience of how I came to understand One Health. And this was mostly through my master's project. So I am a wildlife veterinarian by training. And so my first patient in most cases is the wild animal. So for my master's, I was looking at disease issues for jaguars in a rainforest reserve in Nicaragua. And it turned out that one of the biggest threats for these jaguars is probably canine distemper virus. So I'm interested in this jaguar and protecting its health. But now I'm suddenly also interested in this dog and its health. And that's because dogs are the reservoir species for canine distemper virus. So that's where the jaguar is going to get the distemper virus from. And if I am interested in the health of this dog, I have to be interested in the health and the well-being of the Mayangna people who have purchased this dog and are relying on it to help them hunt for food. And if I'm interested in how all three of these groups are feeding themselves and staying healthy, then I also have to be interested in the health and the resilience of the Bosawas rainforest and its waterways, because every living thing in this system depends on it for food and water. And so a really good example of that is when trees are cut down in the forest, it pushes jaguars closer and closer into the human habitation. And that increases their risk of getting distemper. That increases the likelihood that the Mayangna people who are living there are going to have their livestock get eaten, and they're going to become food insecure or go hungry. And it increases the likelihood that they're actually going to end up killing jaguars in retaliation. So all of this, the health of each one of these components are all really interconnected. And that was my first experience of really understanding that. So One Health is a huge issue. We are talking about pandemics today, and specifically wildlife and ecosystem health in pandemics. So the issues that we're going to focus most on are going to be zoonotic diseases and emerging infectious diseases in general. So I always want to take a minute to define zoonotic diseases again. They are diseases transmitted between humans and non-human animals. So we often think of them as diseases transmitted from non-human animals to humans, but it's really important to understand that just like these arrows here, all throughout this diagram showing disease transfer, zoonotic diseases go both ways. These are all bidirectional arrows. But when we're thinking about pandemics like COVID, we're really thinking about emerging infectious diseases, and 75% of emerging infectious diseases in humans actually have an animal origin. They originally came from an animal. And the vast, vast majority of these have a wildlife species as a reservoir. But this isn't new, right? So historically, our biggest pandemics that have wiped out millions of people have been emerging zoonotic diseases like the Black Death or bubonic plague or the Spanish flu. And we all live with endemic zoonotic diseases like rabies and salmonella and tuberculosis all of the time. But again, when we think about pandemic risk, we're really focusing on these emerging diseases like Ebola, HIV, influenza, West Nile virus, Zika, and of course, COVID-19. And just to define what I mean by emerging, this can be a new pathogen like COVID, a pathogen we've never seen before, but it can also just be a pathogen that's moved into a new host species, a new geographic area, or that is increasing in prevalence for some reason. So wild animals have always carried a huge diversity of pathogens. This has always been true. That's how we got the bubonic plague way back when. But the incidence of these spillover events, this wildlife to human disease transfer, has been increasing. Emergence has been increasing in frequency. So that leads to the question of what causes wildlife to human spillover and why is it happening more frequently? And this is taken from a paper that I love called Pathways to Spillover. It's from 2017 by Raina Plowright. And it shows really all of these barriers that we have to spillover, why they kind of don't usually happen, but that if everything lines up just right, each one of these components, then we actually get spillover into the human population. So these, I'm going to sort of go through each of these in a little bit more detail as we go through the talk, but we've got the reservoir's host distribution and density are two really important things. And then within that reservoir population, we've got pathogen prevalence, infection intensity, and then pathogen release from the reservoir host, or just shedding, pathogen shedding. That's the easiest way to think of it for me. And then we have sort of how does the pathogen get into the human? And so we have each one of those pathways. So what makes those holes line up? What drives each one of those elements so that we get this clear pathway to an emerging zoonotic disease? And the answer is actually human behavior. So we tend to think of it as like, oh, well, bats harbor all of these viruses. Well, bats have always harbored all of these viruses. So what has changed is the way we interact with wildlife and the ecosystems around us. And if you want to look at the UN environmental programs or different infectious disease experts, examples of the main drivers of these, you get four main ones that relate to wildlife. The first one is deforestation and other land use changes, climate change, illegal or poorly regulated wildlife trade. That's important to emphasize because a lot of people rely on wildlife for food and subsistence in sustainable ways throughout the world. And so it's how it's done that we need to focus on and not necessarily the fact that it exists. And then biodiversity loss itself. So each one of these things impacts biodiversity, right? But there are some reasons why just losing biodiversity actually drives zoonotic disease emergence that I'm going to go over in a little bit. So going back to that spillover pathway, this is a sort of condensed version of it. What are the mechanisms through which each one of those things I just mentioned actually amplify this pathway? So if we start up here with habitat fragmentation and degradation and climate change, those are going to affect our host distribution and density. Those are going to affect where animals live and how many of them live there. And the ways they affect them is that they move animals to new areas, they push them into new places, and they increase density in small fragments. So when you have a smaller patch of land, you have increased density. It's pretty straightforward. And then when we think about more aspects of land use change, some of the things that come together with habitat fragmentation and climate change, you get these sort of individual level factors like loss of natural resources. You can have exposure to pollutants, and you have stress-mediated immunosuppression. So all of these are things that are happening to wild animals under ecosystem stress. And what happens then is an animal that doesn't have appropriate food or shelter or water is going to have increased individual susceptibility to infection. So that's our step right here. At a population level, that's going to cause increased prevalence and intensity of infection. So that's our level here. And then it's going to also cause increased shedding. All of these things are going to be driven up. And then getting to this bottom section of how pathogens get from a wildlife host into a human, land use change and wildlife trade and consumption are really important here. And really what this comes down to is increasing human and wildlife or domestic animal-wildlife contact. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is really go through an example of how each of those 4 main drivers has led to a pandemic emergence or an epidemic emergence. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the example of deforestation and land use change and Nipah virus. So I'm taking us here to Malaysia in 1998. And Nipah virus, for anybody who doesn't know, it was a previously unknown encephalitic virus. It emerged in a single outbreak in Malaysia in 1998 and has been found many other places since then. It was a relatively small outbreak, so only 265 cases, but the mortality rate was equal to that of Ebola. So this was a very fatal disease, and it was killing people at a really high rate. So what caused emergence, what we know about transmission is we know that flying foxes or fruit bats were transmitting it via mango trees that were planted on pig farms. So the bats would come and they would eat these mangoes or any other fruit, and then they would drop the fruit. And then the pigs would eat what was left of the fruit, and they would get the Nipah virus. And then that would get spread to humans, and then human-to-human transmission was possible. So again, it's easy to say, well, oh, the bat caused it. Well, again, the bats have probably had this virus for a very, very long time. So what did we change to make this spread into humans? And so the answer in this case was deforestation. That caused bats to move into these farms looking for more food, and it also caused the farms to go out into the forest where the bats were. So then we had a lot more of this sort of bat-pig interaction than we normally would have had, and this opportunity for spillover for the very first time. And there's a lot of really good data that shows that that's really the case, that it was the movement of farms into the forest and forest destruction that caused that bat-pig interaction. And by controlling bat-pig interactions and the way they're farming, they haven't had another outbreak ever since that first outbreak. So bringing us back to this pathway, here we are with habitat fragmentation and degradation, and it caused those bats to shift distribution to a new habitat. And the land use change in this case was conversion from forest to agriculture, which increased our domestic animal and wildlife contact. So moving on to climate change, I'm going to take you to an actual ICM project, or Institute for Conservation Medicine project, that we have worked on in Kenya for a period of time. In Kenya, this is a map of Kenya right here, and this dark red is basically a map of loss of precipitation. So these are drought areas. This is how much less rainfall these areas are getting than they used to. And as Kenya becomes more and more arid under climate change, people have been switching from cattle to camels for their milk and meat needs. And that makes sense, right? Because camels are very drought resistant. They do well with little water, and cattle don't. So at this point, there's 3 to 5 million camels in Kenya, which is up 78% in the past 30 years. And up to 4 million Kenyans right now are drinking unpasteurized milk. So this is a massive movement of a new livestock species. And so the work that we've been doing is pathogen surveillance in these camels to try to understand what sorts of pathogens they have that might be risk to humans or to wildlife. And in this case, for humans, we've discovered really high seroprevalence for Q fever, or Coxiella burnetii, and much higher than it is in other livestock. So that is a pathogen that those camels, due to climate change, are bringing across the landscape with them. And we also found, and really this was the work of my mentor and our director, Dr. Deem, we found MERS coronavirus antibodies in these camels as well. And so to remind us all about MERS, this was the last coronavirus pandemic. It also has a bat origin. In this case, the intermediate host is our camels, and it adapted and spilled over into humans through agricultural trade at that time, and has since spread to many other locations. Nothing like the current coronavirus we're having, fortunately. But the point I want to focus on here is not actually the spillover from camels to humans, but this original spillover from bats to camels, because that is what caused this to adapt and eventually make its way to humans. And again, this was increased by movement of camels into wild lands, loss of bat habitat causing them to move into human-dominated landscapes, and it's ongoing in Kenya. So there was a recent study in 2019 that showed that bat coronavirus antibodies, new ones, are appearing in Kenyan camels, which is concerning because there could be the development of a new coronavirus through camels that could be like MERS, but more contagious, like our current COVID pandemic. So visiting our pathways to spillover again, in this case, we had climate change causing, again, a shift in distribution of animals to a new habitat. In this case, these animals were the camels, they were the livestock, but we had simultaneous land use change that caused domestic animal-wildlife contact. So that increased bat-camel contact that eventually causes reassortment, mutation, and spillover into humans. So that brings us to one of our third drivers, and the one that is most on people's minds today, and that's unregulated wildlife trade. And the best example of that and the dangers it poses are COVID-19, or is COVID-19. This is the map from last night of COVID cases in the world from Johns Hopkins. And again, when we think about emergence, we think about right here in Wuhan in China. So just like MERS coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, we believe it has a horseshoe bat origin or reservoir. We don't know what its intermediate host is. So for MERS, we know it's camels. For SARS-CoV-2, we really haven't been able to figure it out yet. I added a little pangolin in here because there was some early research that said it might have been pangolins, but that looks like that's probably not the case. But we know it went through something because the virus that's in bats and the virus that's in humans is not the same virus. So how did this happen? This is where the wildlife trade comes in. So in this environment, we've all heard about the market in Wuhan, where domestic animals and wildlife species were sold side by side for food primarily, or for medicine. So in this case, we have these horseshoe bats being harvested for food and medicine, and they're being kept in the same location as these pangolins and these snakes, and also the same location as these chickens and this man. And this provides a perfect sort of mixing pot where you can just stir all those viruses together. These animals are highly stressed, so they are shedding. They're immunosuppressed because they're not being fed well. They're stressed again, so they're offloading really large amounts of virus. And it's mixing between species, and that is a perfect scenario for this intermediate host adaptation to make this virus something that humans can get. And then once it's in humans, we all know what happened. So it traveled rapidly around the world. And I bring this up, this is actually an image of 24 hours of airline travel in the world. So this is in one day, all of the flights that take place. And I just always want to remind people of this because it can be easy for us to think that what is happening in a community really far away won't affect us. But this is one of the best examples of why what happens in a food market in Wuhan, China could have a huge impact on your life and why we all need to be concerned about it. So those components, again, that I just mentioned, again, just going into those mechanisms of how wildlife trade drove the emergence of COVID-19, we have that stress-mediated immunosuppression of all those animals in cages at the market, and we increased our human wildlife and our domestic animal to wildlife contact and created that mixing pot that I was just talking about. Oh, huh. Oh, apologies. I'm going to go ahead and talk on this slide, but this is not the version of the slide that I wanted you to see. But what I want you to hear from this slide is that, when we think about wildlife trade, there are some special drivers. And those drivers are that mixing pot that I was talking about. So bringing together species that would not normally be in contact, it doesn't just increase the rate of transmission between those species, it actually creates increased reassortment of viruses and evolutionary selective pressure for that virus to adapt to new hosts. So the more times you expose a human to a virus or a virus to a human, the more pressure there is for that virus to be able to infect that human in an effective way, because it'll survive better if it can infect that person instead of just dying out and having that be a dead-end host. So that's a really special component of wildlife trade that I like to think about. And what you're looking at in this picture is from markets in Vietnam. So these are field rats that are a food source, and they're harvested in the wild, and they are brought to markets, and they are skinned and sold in restaurants. And there was a really excellent study done by the Wildlife Conservation Society and colleagues looking at coronaviruses in these rats. And it demonstrates just this process, that there's this reassortment and this selective pressure. So when you look at the rats in the field, they have about 20% positivity for coronavirus antibodies. By the time they get to the market, they're around 32%. And by the time they get to restaurants, they're 56%. So prevalence of that pathogen. So this is really actually that susceptibility and immunity functions. Prevalence of that pathogen is going up along that entire wildlife supply chain. So the further that animal gets from the wild, the closer it gets to your dinner plate, the higher the probability is it's going to carry a coronavirus, and it's going to pass that coronavirus to something else. Equally important, the coronaviruses they find in those rats, by the time they get to that restaurant, are also bat coronaviruses and avian coronaviruses. Those are viruses that should not be in a rodent. So it demonstrates that mixing and that reassortment and the opportunities for reassortment. Again, I apologize for the formatting on this slide. I'm not totally sure what happened, but hopefully you could follow me. So I wanted to also just put each one of those examples I've given so far into a broader context, which is they are all about people trying to feed themselves. So when we look at Nipah virus, that was putting pig farms, clearing forests for pig farms, and how we farm for pigs. When we looked at the climate change example, again, that was a need for protein in Kenyan pastoralists. So bringing camels along the landscape to supplement for cattle that they were losing. And COVID-19, we're again looking at how people are meeting their protein needs. And there are almost 8 billion people on our planet today, and 1 in 4 of us experience moderate to severe food insecurity. So how we are going to figure out how to feed all of these people in a way that does not drive pandemics, does not create these mixing pots, is one of the most pressing questions of our day. The food chain is one of the top 2 or 3 places that we cause emerging infectious diseases. So there's one thing that I haven't talked about yet out of these 3, and that's biodiversity loss. And that's because I think biodiversity loss is a little bit different. So biodiversity loss really happens up here again, at this wildlife host distribution and density. When we lose biodiversity, we lose something called the dilution effect, and the ecosystem service of the dilution effect. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what that is. So for this example, I'm going to take you back to the US, where I am today, and look at a more recently emerging disease called Lyme disease. And the reason I'm focusing on Lyme disease is because Lyme disease was the model system through which the dilution effect was originally discovered or described. Lyme disease is a tick-borne disease. Here are my little tick friends. And it causes this characteristic rash. You get that rash after you get your tick bite. And then after that, you'll get sort of an undulating fever. You may not, but you end up with a chronic disease that can attack many different systems in your body. It's very hard to diagnose, and it is very hard to treat if you don't catch it until later. But it is very debilitating for people who live with it. So the things I want you to know about Lyme disease and transmission that you need to understand what we're going to talk about with the dilution effect are really that in the northeastern US, where this is a big problem, the basic transmission cycle is ticks. Their primary food source are these white-tailed deer, and they eat the deer blood and replicate in really large numbers. But deer aren't good hosts for Lyme disease. Who is a really good host for Lyme disease is this white-footed mouse. So deer increase tick numbers, but not Lyme disease. White-footed mice increase tick numbers and increase Lyme disease. And this is a classic reservoir host. They don't get sick, but they give it to the tick, and then ticks give it to people. So how does the dilution effect work? What is it? It's this basic principle that in general, as biodiversity decreases in a system, zoonotic transmission risk actually increases. So loss of biodiversity leads to increased zoonotic disease transmission. That's not intuitive. So why does that happen? Well, it happens, we think, because in general, our common species are really good hosts for zoonotic diseases. So if you look at this figure from this recent paper in PNAS, rodents, the ones that we classify as superhosts, are incredibly common. They are species of least concern. When we get rare species, like these critically endangered species, they turn out to not host any zoonotic diseases. And we see that trend across the main taxa, the main mammalian taxa that carry zoonotic diseases. So in general, the trend you're seeing in each of these, the black bar gets bigger and bigger as you go to the right. So there are more abundant species that are really good hosts for zoonotic diseases. And when we keep those bad host species around in our system, it actually dilutes out the disease risk. And another important component of this is that these species not only are more common in general, but they increase in human-modified habitats. So this is a recent paper by Gibb in Nature, and you can see that as we move from primary habitat, so like an old-growth forest, all the way to urban habitats, the proportion of really good zoonotic host species, that's this brown, it goes up. So not only are common species in general better hosts, but as we disturb habitats, we increase those common species, and we increase the number of good hosts that we have in our environment. So bringing us back to Lyme disease and what that example looks like in Lyme disease. So if you remember, we talked about the white-tailed deer creating lots of ticks. So not good Lyme disease hosts. These ticks, orange means no Lyme disease, green means Lyme disease. These white-footed deer are really great Lyme disease hosts. So they infect some of these ticks with Lyme disease. This Virginia possum, it likes to eat ticks, so it provides us an ecosystem service of removing ticks from the environment. And then it also is not a good host for Lyme disease, so it reduces the overall number of ticks, and only about half these ticks are actually infected. And so when you put a human into this landscape, you can see here, this represents sort of a 50% risk of this human getting Lyme disease. This is a nice biodiverse community. We've got these opossums, we've got these deer, and we've got some white-footed mice. But each one of these is a contact, and only 50% of the contacts are going to be a Lyme disease contact. Over here, we lost these possums and these deer. The only animals that it's coming into contact with are these mice, and the odds that it's going to come into contact with a tick that bit this mouse and gives it Lyme disease are substantially higher. So biodiversity is actually decreasing the risk that people are going to get Lyme disease. And that is the dilution effect and how it works. And then I also, before I leave all of these topics, I wanted to remind us that emerging diseases and pandemics don't just happen in humans. They also happen in wildlife. They're a major threat to a lot of species, and the drivers are the same. So when we think about how are we going to address pandemics in humans, we actually have that added benefit of protecting wildlife, and I don't even mention this in this slide, but livestock species as well. So the drivers of disease emergence are really the same across all of these systems. So that is land use change, climate change, wildlife trade, and human-wildlife contact are the big ones that are in this diagram right here in this slide. And I apologize, somebody is knocking at my door really loudly right now. So if I get distracted or you hear the knocking, that's what's happening. Fun times with working from home. So to touch on some of the major wildlife pandemics or epidemics of our day, we have white nose syndrome here on the left-hand side. That is a fungal pathogen that is devastating bats throughout North America. It got to North America, we assume, through human transit. And it has spread from cave to cave, primarily, we think, by humans carrying it on their feet. It's endemic to Asia, and by sort of increasing that human-wildlife contact and land use change, we've spread it in a lot of locations. Chytridiomycosis is another really big one. That is a really urgent conservation crisis. And that is something that is devastating frog populations and has actually caused local extinctions. It is another pathogen that we think is directly related, in this case, to wildlife trade. So the spread of the African clawed frog and bullfrogs into native ecosystems, or their introduction as invasive species and their ability to carry this pathogen into pristine areas. And this last one I wanted to mention, because again, I really like to think about that bidirectional arrow of zoonotic diseases going between humans and animals. So this is a picture of a mountain gorilla. He's picking his nose. This is the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project that I had a chance to work on. And he is picking his nose because he has a cold from a human metapneumovirus. And he got that cold because he shares space with humans. So this is a human pathogen that spilled over into a mountain gorilla. And there was an outbreak in the early 2000s that actually wiped out almost an entire troop of mountain gorillas. So we are similarly a threat to mountain gorillas in the same way we tend to think of wildlife being threats to us. So getting back to really the point of this talk was the role of wildlife and ecological health in preventing pandemics. And I hope I've given you a lot of examples over this talk of how ecological health is actually the key to pandemic prevention. We have these wildlife right here. They have viruses, they have bacteria, they always have, but really these drivers that are pushing these transmission cycles are, again, deforestation and land use change, climate change, poorly regulated wildlife trade, and biodiversity loss. And there are other drivers as well, but when we think about wildlife and how we really make these arrows bigger, this wildlife to human, wildlife to peri-domestic wildlife, and wildlife to livestock, these four factors are really the key to driving or preventing this sort of spillover and transmission. Okay, so hopefully you all made it through that knocking, and I think stuff is quieted down on my end, and I'm ready for some questions if we have some. Oh, Lillian, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. Congrats for your presentation. It was amazing, and how important is this topic for us in Brazil. And we host the highest biodiversity in the world. We host the highest like livestock trade in the world, and we have big problems with deforestation here as well, especially now in this moment in Brazil. Then it's super important to have this conversation in a science meeting inside of a university. And thank you for having all of this with us. We have some questions for you.
Great.
And I will start. Then let's go. Yeah, the first one was, how do you think One Health approach can be improved around the world, especially in South America or Central America and developed countries?
Yeah, so gosh, I almost want to ask everybody who's watching that question, because I think I have a good sense of what we can do sort of on a global scale and what I can do on a local scale where I work. But I don't work in South and Central America. And so one of the biggest things I believe in my work is that I'm an American from the United States. So I don't want to come into another country and assume that I know what solutions are. I want to support Dr. Catenacci and all of your colleagues in coming up with solutions that are going to work in your scenario. For me, in my case, and again, I think on a global scale, it really helps to just, number one, raise awareness. So you talk about it and you talk about it and you talk about it to all of the right people. I'm here today and I feel grateful for that opportunity to share this in a scientific setting and share it with a whole bunch of people who are interested and who are hopefully going to then take that message and share it with people who matter, like farmers, like policymakers. So for me in the US, I have a lot of power with my vote. So when I talk to students who can vote in the US, that's one of the biggest things that I tell them to do, is to hold our representatives accountable. I work in a lot of places, though, where people don't even have the opportunity to vote. And they need much more local solutions to their problems where they actually have that power. I do think it's really important that things like the OIE and the WHO and the FAO are doing things like creating One Health tripartites. So they're organizing and recognizing at this really large global scale that these things are important. And if you noticed, a lot of my graphics were from the UN or from the World Health Organization. So people who direct policy on a global scale are starting to understand this and starting to create mechanisms for us all to work together and address things on a planetary health level. But yeah, I'm super curious what makes sense to you in terms of Brazil and what opportunities there are and what next steps you think are needed. And not that, I mean, you're supposed to be asking me questions, but.
Yeah, thank you. I think you have a big challenge here. And as you said, like the vote, I think it's one thing, really important thing that you should have better than you are doing now. And also, I think you use our land in a conscious way and not only using the economic way that's not giving opportunity for our people, the poor people. We had one of the highest social inequality in the world. Well, I think you are 2 or 3, like it's really, really bad. And I think this is a big problem. We have money, but we're not giving the money for all of us. It's what I feel about this. And I think if you're not moving this, you'll be a problem. Yeah. I have one, I'm not, sorry.
Go.
Now I have another question for you. And I think you are already replying us. That was, how can the world prevent or be prepared for a new pandemic?
Yeah, so I think I could give a whole different lecture on this. So up until now, when we focus on wildlife disease spillover into humans, the research has mostly been this really big USAID funded project called PREDICT. And you read all of these papers, and it turns out almost all of them sort of came out of PREDICT surveillance. And what they have focused on is really, really important work. And it is looking in wild animals and in livestock for viruses that we think will sort of be the next pandemic. Which viruses are the ones that are most likely to spill over in the near future? So that's great. However, I would say that it doesn't, like the next step is how do we prevent that spillover from happening? So we know those viruses are there. We can use that information about viruses to know where to focus, but what we really need to do is to stop that spillover. And I think, I think that's my whole talk in a lot of ways is when you make a decision about, and by you, I mean both you as an individual and as a society, right? Whether or not you are going to cut down your forest, think about whether or not you are increasing your disease risk, because you are. Is there a better way for you to get food than to cut down forests so that you can grow cattle or so you can grow palm oil? What are ways that we can feed ourselves and support ourselves that don't drive new diseases? Because I think that's going to be the most important part of this. So, I mean, I would just go back to those 4 points, right? So, deforestation, slowing carbon emissions so we can slow climate change, regulating wildlife trade in an effective way that takes into consideration the needs of people who actually need to feed themselves also. And wrapped up in that is doing what we can to protect biodiversity. And then there's after spillover things that you can do to help, but those aren't prevention. Those are preparedness. So people are doing a lot of things like working on universal coronavirus vaccines, for instance, so that as coronaviruses keep mutating, we'll have maybe a vaccine in place so that the new one won't be a pandemic. We will already be vaccinated for it. But those solutions, they're always after the fact, right? They're always playing catch up and trying to address the problem that already happened. So to me, the best way to be prepared for pandemics is to understand how they get created and do what we can to prevent that spillover in the first place.
Thank you. I'm going to translate a little bit. Sorry. Desculpa, gente, só com relação à primeira pergunta que foi feita, né? Então, uma das coisas que a doutora Marisa falou para a gente é que ela é uma americana, ela vive lá, então, assim, ela não se sente à vontade de falar dos problemas dos outros países e dar pitaco nos outros países. Então, ela começou a dar exemplo de como ela, aqui como nos Estados Unidos, ela acredita que seja o caminho, né, para abordar sobre saúde única e pensar em prevenir pandemias e etc. Então, uma das coisas que ela falou foi voto. Então, falar muito com as pessoas, falar e conseguir colocar no poder pessoas que acreditem no que a gente acredita de saúde única. Então, votar corretamente, votar com consciência. Então, é uma das coisas que ela falou. Aí depois ela me perguntou o que eu poderia dizer como solução para o meu país. Aí eu falei que também achava que voto era algo importante e que aqui nós temos nós somos um país rico, mas com uma das maiores desigualdades sociais do planeta, né? Então, nós temos dinheiro, só que o dinheiro não chega a gente. Então, é preciso que essa desigualdade ela tenha mecanismos que diminuam, e o voto é um deles. Né? Além de o uso do solo, né, como a gente utiliza o nosso solo hoje em dia, com as monoculturas e tudo mais, faz com que tudo isso que ela colocou na apresentação também acelere todo esse processo e a gente não tenha essa abordagem de como a gente gostaria. E a outra pergunta que foi feita é como prevenir, né, e como saber e prevenir a pandemia. E aí o que ela falou que a gente tem que pensar em 2 momentos, que ela daria uma aula sobre isso, assim, né, seria um outro tópico para ficar 50 minutos conversando, mas que a gente tem que pensar sobre 2 perspectivas e que a gente tem que encarar como tentar resolver antes que o spillover, antes que a pandemia realmente aconteça, né, que essa transmissão ela realmente aconteça. Então, a gente tem que pensar em 2 aspectos. O primeiro seria, será que eu, localmente, individualmente, a gente está comprando comida como deveria ser, a gente está utilizando os nossos meios da maneira que a gente acredita que vai melhorar o nosso planeta ou não, ou a gente só está contribuindo para essas mudanças climáticas e etc. e tal. Então, que a gente tenha uma consciência sobre isso. E aí repetiu a história de nós temos que colocar pessoas no poder para fazer políticas públicas que sejam realmente, que você acredite, né, que estejam dentro dessa linha de saúde única, e que a gente tem que tentar, existe um projeto chamado Predict, é muito bacana esse projeto, que ele realmente tenta descobrir, beleza, onde são os pontos, os hotspots, né, que são mais importantes para a gente ter locais onde a gente tem as pandemias, onde pode ter as pandemias. A gente precisa reconhecer esses hotspots, e isso já é feito por esse projeto, que é um projeto global, mas que só isso não é suficiente. Então, conhecer o primeiro passo e a gente precisa trabalhar no antes, porque o depois, o que vai sobrar é o que a gente está vendo hoje, todo mundo na corrida da vacina, né? Então as universidades tentando pensar numa vacina ou tentando descobrir qual o tratamento e etc. Mas a gente precisa dar um passo a mais de só descobrir, esse é o local, tá bom, esse é o local, o que a gente vai fazer para que esse local, essa pandemia não aconteça. Então isso tem que partir tanto individualmente como localmente. Mais ou menos isso que consegui aqui pegar e passar para vocês. Okay, you have 2 more questions, if it's okay for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, sorry. How is the population informed about the animals that can transmit diseases to humans, considering that some species are hunted for consumption? For example, the armadillo. And I think it's kind of the same question for another person, that how could you change the millennial culture that, like, the original people habitats? For example, eating animals for wildlife for food or something like this. How could you change? Yeah, I don't know if I made clear for you.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, those are also really good questions. So I'll maybe, the first thing I think of is the communities that I worked in Nicaragua, because I actually would say that there are certain circumstances. So the indigenous communities that I lived and worked in, they live in the middle of the rainforest. They hunt for food. To transition them to livestock would actually be a really bad idea for everybody, because we would have to clear a whole bunch of the forest for cattle. It would introduce a whole bunch of new diseases. It would actually not protect them. So there are times and places where actually subsistence hunting is really important for people, but they're very rare. Most of the time, simply because there's so many people on this planet, and because of the way our economic system works and trade works, when we hunt wildlife or consume wildlife, we do it in an unsustainable way, and we do it in a way that's dangerous for us. So I think you need multiple approaches. So one thing you need is regulations, right? So you need a law, and you need it to be enforced. But just punishing people doesn't win anybody's heart over, right? It doesn't change anyone's mind. So, and this is where I think your solutions have to get very local, and because I think you really need to work in different communities to come up with solutions that work for them for how they're going to feed themselves. So again, in the US, a huge part of what I do is just tell people to eat less meat. We eat so much meat in this country that we don't need. And if we ate less animals, that would solve that problem. For so many places, they actually don't get enough protein, right? So they barely have enough. I used to work with a doctor at UC Davis in the One Health Institute, and he does a really good program in the communities in a different place in Nicaragua, increasing like chickens, basically. Like his thing is like eggs are the answer to everything because they provide really dense nutrition. Chickens can forage for their food, but you need to vaccinate them for Newcastle disease. They can carry avian influenza. So it's tricky. You really need to think about in your community, what are your disease risks? What are people willing to accept? And you have to work with them really closely to come up with a solution that they'll like. And it will be a compromise, whatever solution you come up with. It won't be what you thought was a good idea. But
Thank you. Just translating. Bom, gente, aí a doutora Maris estava falando que o que ela acredita mesmo é que a gente tenha que pensar em trabalhar localmente, né? Então, para que isso possa acontecer, de que, por exemplo, ela deu outro exemplo dos Estados Unidos, que nos Estados Unidos se consome muito mais proteína do que é o necessário, então mudanças de hábitos também são importantes, e a gente pensar no sistema social e econômico que a gente vem levando hoje no mundo, né? Então, isso tudo tem que ser levado em consideração. E estar próximo das comunidades, porque a solução ela pode ser uma solução global se a gente consegue trabalhar localmente com cada uma dessas comunidades, né? Então, se a gente consegue entender o problema de cada uma dessas comunidades. Foi um pouco isso que eu fui pegando aí da conversa que a gente foi tendo. Vou ver se eu lembro de mais alguma coisa, mas aí outra... acho que foi isso, não sei se eu estou esquecendo de alguma coisa, eu vou tentar lembrar, que eu estou anotando aqui um pouco. I have another question for you that I feel is this from the same way. How do you see the zoonosis scenario and all the disturbing, the fragment, environment alterations in undeveloped countries? What do you think that could be the first step for change this scenario? And the other question is all the intensification of livestock and the animals, wildlife trade, and also all the high consumption of meat are really part of the people that work in the land. What could I do to reduce all these risks of spillover, pandemic, whatever? E eu lembrei disso, sorry. Eu só lembrei de uma outra coisa que ela falou que é importante, que ela trabalhou na Nicarágua, e o que ela disse é que os pesquisadores dali, eles também começaram a trabalhar localmente com as comunidades, criando frangos. Então, se lá não tinha proteína nenhuma, então eles criavam frangos para ter a proteína animal. Só que esses frangos não eram criados soltos, eles eram criados de uma maneira correta, vacinados, então com controle do que estava sendo feito ali. Uma outra coisa que ela falou que era importante também, que acho que a primeira coisa é ter leis. A gente precisa ter leis, só que só punir não vai adiantar. Por isso que a gente precisa pensar numa solução local. Então, o que foi feito na Nicarágua foi isso. Diversas comunidades tiveram apoio e monitoramento de outras criações. Só que essas criações elas eram realmente realizadas com os animais com qualidade de vida, né, de saúde, monitoramento de saúde. Desculpa, eu lembrei disso agora. Sorry, Maris.
That's okay. Okay, I may not remember everything that I'm supposed to answer, but I'll try. So, I guess I think overall, it's hard to talk about things on a big scale and a small scale at the same time because they're so different. I think that we know. So if you have somebody who is farming, or somebody who is a pastoralist or is a hunter, and they're doing the best they can, and they're not clearing huge tracts of forest, and they're just working to feed their families. Sorry, that's my cat. Then we know a lot about how to keep people safe from zoonotic diseases, but they're things like basic biosecurity. So when you have, like I mentioned Newcastle, so they've developed a thermostable Newcastle vaccine that you can give to chickens, so you don't have to keep it refrigerated anymore. So that's one really good thing you can do. So you vaccinate when you can. You whenever you can, try to keep like your chickens from pooping in your house. Like, it's a simple thing, but it's actually really hard to implement a lot of times. You need access to clean water if you want to clean your hands, but washing your hands is one of the simplest things you can do to keep yourself safe, right? That's another thing we learned in COVID. So all of that sort of everything that if you're a vet, you already know about livestock, right? And how to care for your livestock. That's still true in this situation. It works for a scary emerging pathogen just as well as it works for salmonella. So that's one thing I always want to say. Another thing you really need to do is have really active, so as a society, you need to have active surveillance systems. So you really need to identify when diseases are spilling over early so that they don't become pandemics, right? So, and some of that is syndromic surveillance. So some of that is just knowing when people are getting sick with certain things or having certain symptoms. There's a really, really active syndromic surveillance system in Kenya, and it triggers really rapid testing because they'll get symptoms that look like Rift Valley fever, and that will trigger their public health department, or actually their Kenyan Wildlife Service, if it's in wildlife, to go out and test. And then when they go out and test, then they can do the right control method. So for Rift Valley fever, that might be clearing standing water because it's a mosquito-transmitted disease. So surveillance is really important, and One Health surveillance is really important, right? So you need to do domestic animals, wild animals, and people. Very much so, yeah. That is one really good way to also help keep people safe. And that's something you're going to be doing at the same time as you are fighting for policy change so that you stop cutting down rainforest. So how do we keep all of us safe while we're trying to change these really big systems that have a lot of money behind them and a lot of global power, and that are going to take a lot more human willpower to shift?
Ok, thank you. A doutora Maris estava dizendo, né, que assim, a gente já sabe o que a gente pode fazer para ajudar essas pessoas numa escala mais local, né? Pensar em biosseguridade e em biossegurança. E isso a gente já sabe, o que a gente precisa é que isso chegue nessas comunidades, né? Então, por exemplo, esse exemplo que ela deu aí das galinhas, dos frangos, para levar segurança alimentar de uma maneira que tivesse menos chance de ter todas as spillovers e etc, né? Então, assim, o que a gente precisa fazer é colocar a gente, como veterinário, profissionais da saúde, colocar que essas informações cheguem desde pequeno produtor, a médio produtor, a grande produtor, porque essas maneiras, elas vão servir desde vírus para bactérias. Então, se a gente pensa em protocolos, né, de biossegurança e biosseguridade, a gente já sabe o que fazer, a gente só precisa fazer que isso chegue. E a outra coisa que é importante ter, além disso chegar, é que a gente tenha um sistema de vigilância ativa para tentar detectar onde a gente possivelmente pode ter esses problemas ali. Então, as pessoas que estão ficando doentes né, e a gente não fecha diagnóstico, então tem surto por aí, ou mesmo animal, né, então que a gente consiga fazer uma vigilância ativa para que a gente detecte esses problemas antes de realmente ter um surto. Então, isso é uma outra coisa que ela vê como um próximo passo para mudar. E aí, de novo, ela fala, né, da importância da gente, como formadores de opinião, e mudanças de políticas também, né? Então, a gente precisa ser mais ativo mesmo, porque o que a gente precisa é de dinheiro, a gente depende do poder humano, né, para essas mudanças em políticas públicas. Então, que a gente precisa levar essa informação para as outras pessoas para que a gente tenha política pública, tá? Okay, thank you. I think I have a last one, maybe. Let's see. Oh, I skip one. Sorry. Just I have the last one, and then we can finalize. Do you think that this conservation medicine and One Health topic is getting into the science universities in an often correctly way? And I still feel that we keep teaching in a separate boxes. What do you think? Yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think I think it's new, so it's early to expect a lot of really good change. But I can tell you that so I went to school at the University of California, Davis, right? And they have an entire One Health Institute there. Nevertheless, it's almost entirely veterinarians and veterinary epidemiologists who work at the One Health Institute. And I think this is a really big problem. And we see this problem not just in universities, but we also see it when we try to get funding for things. So when you go and you write a grant, if you write it to the Ministry of Health, they want it to be about humans and they don't want to hear about animals. If you write it to the Department of Agriculture, they want it to be about livestock and no one else. If it's, your Fish and Wildlife or Forestry Department, they just want it to be about wildlife. And I think awareness is changing. And I think there are people who are understanding that we need to collaborate, but we're not there in terms of breaking down those boundaries and separating those silos between our disciplines. So we're all getting together in the rooms and talking more often, which is great, but it's just barely like this much starting to make it into universities and funding agencies and even academic journals. Like, it can be hard to figure out where you should publish your work sometimes because it doesn't fit into a box. So yeah. I will say one of our major universities here, they're starting a new school and they're proposing to have that school, instead of it being a public health school, they're proposing to have it be a One Health school so that it will really be fully interdisciplinary. We'll see if it happens. I have my fingers crossed.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Maris está dizendo que ela colocou um exemplo, por exemplo, da universidade onde ela se formou e onde ela trabalhou, que existe um centro muito grande de One Health, na universidade aqui de Davis, mas se ela for olhar todas as pessoas que trabalham lá, a maioria deles são veterinários ou são veterinários e epidemiologistas. Então, a gente fala do One Health, mas a gente não fala, assim, realmente essa relação de vários profissionais trabalhando junto, elas não acontecem como a gente gostaria, né? E a mesma coisa quando a gente vai buscar financiamento. Se eu escrevo para o Ministério da Saúde, eu vou ter que pôr um foco muito forte em humanos e vou falar super pouco de animal. Se eu vou para o mapa, a mesma coisa. Então, assim, a gente tem o conceito na mente, mas a gente ainda não consegue trabalhar com diferentes disciplinas juntas. Ela falou que acho que isso também é um processo, né? Porque esse tema de One Health, ele é relativamente novo, e que agora, aqui na universidade dela, vão criar um curso que não é de saúde pública, mas é um curso de saúde única. Então, a ideia é que tenha mesmo essa ideia de interdisciplinaridade, que ela realmente aconteça. Ela está cruzando os dedos aí para que isso aconteça. Eu não sei se tem alguma outra pergunta, mas acho que a gente já está com o nosso tempinho aí já no limite. Eu acho que é isso. I think it's it. I don't see another question, but we already are with our time, like really on time, you know.
Okay.
I'd love to talk more about this, and it would be amazing to have you here in other opportunities. And really, really thank you for all of your participate here and all of your amazing experience to share with us. And I'm super happy to be here and to work as a moderator here. And I hope all of the students enjoyed, and I'm sure they enjoy. And I would like to say thank you for the Zoological of St. Louis, the Institute for Conservation Medicine, for having all the support with us in Brazil, and also really believing in One Health approach. And we are really proud about this. And it's an honor for our postgraduate program to have the St. Louis and Dr. Maris with us. Então, só agradeci, né, gente, e disse que muito obrigada. Para a gente é um privilégio poder ter o pessoal do Zoológico de St. Louis. Eles já nos apoiam aqui no programa com financiamentos, então para a gente é uma honra poder ter não só a parte financeira, mas a expertise deles com a gente, né? Então, eu vou passar agora a palavra para a professora Socorro. Você vai passar os avisos, Socorro, que a gente aí depois vai para o meeting. Okay? Yeah, Dr. Socorro is just going to end this section.
Okay.
Just a minute, Maris.
Okay, thank you very much for your brilliant talk. This subject, this theme is so relevant and new for everyone, but we need to understand it, because otherwise another pandemic and more will come, and we are not prepared for that. So we need to go deep in this subject and One Health to get a better world in the future, for sure. So thank you very much for your talk. It was so interesting. Okay, thank you. I hope to see you here next year, maybe. Ok. Então, gente, a gente vai encerrar a palestra e aí os alunos da sessão de apresentação hoje das avaliações, a gente tem que ir para o Google Meet para a gente começar nossas apresentações lá, tá bom? See you!
Thank you, Dr. Maris. Thank you, everybody, for having this seminar too with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Obrigada, tá?